You might be asking yourself if 2023 is the right year for you to jump into the real estate market. Whether you're a buyer or a seller, there's a lot of uncertainty and fear in the real estate market and in the United States economy right now. In today's video, I want to help you guys see through the fear of fog, and I'm going to give you guys the 5 biggest predictions that I have coming for the 2023 housing market. Right now, the biggest question I'm getting asked by a lot of my clients is 2023 going to be a good year for real estate? And after the crazy year that 2022 was for real estate, I can see why a lot of people have a lot of fear and anxiety going into this year. Whether you're buying your first home or selling a home, there's a lot of fear and uncertainty going on, not just in the market, but in the media as well. So in today's video, I'm going to be going over the top 5 trends that I'm predicting that we'll be seeing in the 2023 real estate market. Now, these trends aren't just my opinions. I'm going to be pulling some quotes and some data from a lot of trusted real estate professionals and experts in the industry. Now, while no one's got a crystal ball and no one really knows what's in store for the 2023 housing market, one thing is for certain: it is going to be a crazy, bumpy, but fun ride for a lot of people. Now, if you're new here, my name's Kayton. I'm a loan officer from San Diego, California, and on this channel, I help people just like you learn how to buy their first home and navigate the mortgage process smoothly. So for starters, let's just address the elephant in the room. Buying a home right now is not as cheap as a lot of people are trying to make it seem. Mortgage rates are up in a big way from this time last year. Around this time last year, the average mortgage rate was sitting around 3%. And as of today, in January, that average rate is around 6.5%. But if you're waiting for some good news when it comes to interest rates, you might be in luck. The primary driver for interest rates over the last year was inflation. And we saw inflation in the CPI reports go crazy, and everyone was staying tuned because it was pretty certain that a recession was on its way. But as 2022 came to a close, we saw inflation cool off in a big way, and 2023 is poised for more of the same. Looking back on the CPI data from 2022, the worst months were really in February, March, May, and June of last year. But since then, the Fed surprisingly reacted pretty well, although albeit a bit late, but we started to see the trend of really high month-over-month CPI numbers come down in a big way. But if that trend continues the same way in 2023, we could see that CPI number getting as low as 4%, if not lower, by the middle of this year. Now, while that's nowhere near Jerome Powell's 2% inflation goal, that is a big shift from where it was last year. So knowing that rising inflation was the big driver for higher interest rates in 2022, we can imagine that cooling off inflation means for lower rates in 2023 and beyond. Now, how much lower are we talking? Well, it really depends on who you ask. Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac are expecting the average rate for 2023 to be around 6.5%. Meanwhile, the Mortgage Bankers Association is expecting interest rates to be as low as 5.5% this year and as low as 4.5% by 2024. Either way you draw that up, that is an indication that the worst of interest rates rising is behind us, and now we should see them at least leveling off, if not cooling off in a big way, as inflation does the same. The next biggest trend that you should be looking out for, especially if you're a home buyer in 2023, is that sellers are definitely not lowering their prices, but they are giving out a little bit more money. Between the rising costs of goods, rising interest rates, and this pretty much sticky prices of homes, buyers are facing a lot of affordability issues right now, but there are solutions in sight. As you can imagine, with higher interest rates, there's a lot less buyers on the market right now because, frankly, not a lot of people can qualify or afford these mortgages at a higher payment. As a result, sellers are seeing longer times on market for their homes than they were in the past couple of years. So in order to offload their homes, they're having to give out more concessions, whether that's in price or in closing cost credits. I've talked about this in a previous video that I'll link right here, but one of the biggest strategies that most homebuyers are using right now is taking advantage of things like using seller credits for 2-1 buy downs or to pay for their closing costs. Now, while these strategies are a little bit more band-aid than solution, I think these are really good opportunities for home buyers to get into the market now while there's virtually no competition. Now, on the opposite side of the coin, another trend to look out for if you're selling your home or thinking about selling your home is this crazy phenomenon called rate lock-in. Unless you were sitting under a rock during 2020 and 2021 and you were a homeowner or you had bought a home, rates were crazy low. And as a result of these historically low interest rates, we saw pretty much everyone either enter the market and buy at a crazy low interest rate or end up refinancing their homes and locking in at a super low interest rate as well. Now, while this was great for homeowners at the time, this does create a very interesting problem when it comes time to sell. In talking to a lot of the homeowners that I've personally worked with, it's really hard to see a lot of people moving from something like a 2.5% interest rate to a 6.5% interest rate in order to buy their new home. So So we're experiencing this phenomenon known as rate lock-in, where you're locked into your home because of that lower interest rate. See, typically the idea with real estate is you would buy a starter home, build some equity, and use that equity to roll into the new house. So that way the new payment, might be a little bit higher, but not as much because you've used that equity to lower the balance of your loan. But moving from something like a 3% interest rate to a 6.5% interest rate means even though you roll that equity into your new home, you could be increasing your housing payment by as much as $1,000 or sometimes even $2,000 a month to get into that higher priced home. Oh, and by the way, more than likely the prices of homes have gone up too. So you're going to see this rate lock-in really happen in a big way, which will unfortunately affect the amount of inventory coming onto the market. So what exactly does this tough housing market mean if you're renting a home right now? Well, unfortunately, I don't got a lot of good news for you either. Depending on your market, you could see rents continuing to rise as more and more renters decide to lock in and get into a new lease instead of getting into the housing market. In previous years, we saw rents go down just as interest rates did as well in order to fill those homes where renters had pretty much gone into the housing market instead. Not to mention all the movement that was happening during the pandemic, rentals were actually a pretty solid option if you couldn't afford to buy. So in a very real way, you can probably expect to see rents to continue to rise in most markets. Although you could also see a lot more of that single family or multifamily inventory come onto the market instead of the usual big box apartment buildings. Now, I think a trend that should be really interesting to see in 2023, especially for real estate, is watching what happens between the local markets and the national markets. Real estate is one of those things that is really hyper local. What happens in one market doesn't necessarily happen in another market, even if they're neighboring. And as you see these big trends in affordability really push buyers out of their markets because they simply can't afford to live where they have lived for the longest time, you're going to see some markets run a lot hotter and a lot of other markets cool down. For example, Southern California was a big hot market for most of the last 2 years because lower rates made it a lot easier to afford these homes. Not to mention work from home allowed people to move in from other states and get to California. Now, some of that opposite is happening. With higher rates now being the norm while still being able to work from home, you're seeing a lot of Californians actually leave the state and go to more affordable markets. And as a result, these markets are heating up in a big way while California is cooling down. So despite the fact that you might be able to negotiate a better deal in a market like Southern California where it's less competitive, if you're going over to markets that are running a lot hotter, for example, like Tennessee, you might still be bidding against a lot of other buyers, especially people that are expats from other places. All right, so the big question on everyone's mind who's probably watching this, should I buy a home in 2023? Well, I really think it depends. I've been doing loans for a long time and I've seen a lot of successful stories. And the most common thread that I've found with most of my home buyers is they've become the most successful when they're able to buy a home and afford to buy a home in a neighborhood that they love. The reality is there's no timing the market. There's always going to be some downside to buying regardless of what market you're in. The biggest downside of this market right now is rates are higher. And yes, that's true. And prices aren't exactly slipping as much as people hope they would. But there's not a lot of competition and sellers are basically giving out money in ways that I haven't seen really in my entire career. And the last couple of years were super great for home buyers if you wanted a lower interest rate, but you had to compete with 20, 30, sometimes even 50 other people in order to get a home. And a lot of times you were overpaying tens, if not hundreds of thousands of dollars to get into a property in the first place. And this trend will probably continue to go depending on if it's a buyer's market or a seller's market. There's always going to be some reason to not buy a home. But ultimately, the trend shows that if you buy a home and hold on to it as long as you can, you will end up eventually winning. So if you are thinking about buying a home in 2023, make sure you watch this video next because I'm going to be sharing with you the best tips and tricks that I've got to help you get pre-approved for that home loan and make the home buying process a lot simpler. But that's all I've got for this one. I'll see you in the next one. Catch you later.